Good day. Today is Tuesday, 29th July 2025, and today I make this program a few hours after Donald Trump at a meeting in Scotland attended by Keir Starmer. Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, about which I will have more to say in a moment, announced that he was thinking of shortening the ultimatum period that he has delivered to the Russians. Instead of the 50 days that he spoke about 2 weeks ago, roughly 35 days now. Well, he said that he would probably bring it forward to 10 to 12 days. Now, this was said, as I said, impromptu, over the course of a press conference. There's uncertainty as to whether or not he exactly meant it. There's some people who think that, again, he was influenced by what Keir Starmer might have told him over the course of their conversations. There's always uncertainty as to what exactly Donald Trump intends. And of course, he didn't specify what exact sanctions or tariffs he would impose over the course of those 10 to 12 days. Anyway, I'm going to make a few quick observations about Trump's announcement. The announcement itself, or maybe announcement is not a sufficiently strong word, because he said that there would be a more formal announcement, maybe on Monday. We shall have to wait and see. Anyway, let me just make a few quick observations. The first is that I have been involved in many negotiations in my time in which parties regularly impose deadlines on the other side. Now, when it happens, and it's been extremely rare, I can only think of about 2 or 3 times when parties, after they've imposed a deadline, actually shorten it. It is, in my opinion, it has always been, in my experience, on every one of those occasions, a sign of nervousness by the party that set the deadline and which has chosen to shorten it. In fact, in every single case, it has been a sign of weakness. Now, it's not difficult to understand why, because, of course, the point about imposing a deadline is that it's supposed to galvanize the other side into making big concessions. If the other side shows no concern, if it brushes off the threat, if it in no way changes its behavior, the side that's imposed the deadline, and which perhaps is more nervous anyway about its position than it lets on, becomes increasingly frustrated and worried that its deadline is not going to be abided by, and tries to shake the other side by shortening the deadline. In every single case that I can remember, and I have a good memory for this kind of thing, in every single case, it was perceived as a sign of weakness, and that is what it turned out to be. It merely confirmed to the party on the other side that was in receiving the threat that the threat was actually a bluff. Now, of course, we're talking about Donald Trump. We're talking about international diplomacy. What I have discussed is not by any means a hard and fast rule. It's impossible to say exactly what Trump himself is thinking, and of course he is under multiple pressures from many places. But judging by the Russian reaction over the last couple of hours, I suspect that within the Kremlin they are seeing it in exactly the way that I have said, as a sign of nervousness and as a sign of weakness. I will discuss shortly the various comments that the Vice Chair of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, has been making, and his rather strange sequence of exchanges with, of all people, Senator Lindsey Graham of the United States. But suffice to say that Dmitry Peskov, Vladimir Putin's spokesman, actually refused to be drawn and decided that he wouldn't comment on what Trump had said in any way. We have taken note of the statement that President Trump made yesterday. We would like to avoid commenting on it. In other words, the Russians are just going to ignore it. That is the official position that the Kremlin is taking. And that, by the way, is a sign of them calling the bluff. Now, there is a second aspect to this affair which I think is not getting the attention that it deserves, which is that, of course, what Donald Trump threatened the Russians with about, 2 weeks ago, was not just sanctions, but secondary tariffs against countries that buy Russian oil. And of course, the two biggest buyers of Russian oil are India and China, though Turkey is also a major buyer. Now, India has said very little about all of these threats, but yesterday the Indian ambassador to Britain basically said that India has no intention of accepting this ultimatum from Donald Trump. India is the world's third largest energy consumer. We import 80% of our energy. What do you want us to do? Switch off our economy? That was what the Indian ambassador, Vikram Doraiswamy, said to Times Radio in Britain. And it's also been taken up and republished by the Times of India. And the ambassador then went on to say that relations between Russia and India go back to the era, and these are his words, in which some of our Western partners wouldn't sell us weapons, but would sell weapons to countries in our neighborhood that used them only to attack us. So that is a statement by the Indian ambassador to Britain. I'm not sure how far it can be treated as authoritative. He's obviously not a member of the Indian cabinet. He's not Prime Minister Modi or Foreign Minister Jai Shankar. But anyway, he gives the impression that India is not going to bend to Donald Trump's demands on this. India, incidentally, is involved in tense negotiations on trade with the United States as I am making this program and as Donald Trump utters his threat. But for the moment, at least, it looks as if the Indians are standing firm and they're not letting themselves be rattled. Now, here, perhaps it's worth pointing out that India's trade with the United States is in deficit, and the United States is not India's biggest trade partner. China is. And, India is also, of course, a member of the BRICS group, and there is a strong and very vocal constituency in India that demands and insists on better relations with the United States. Up to now, my sense is that this has not been the dominant policy that India has followed over the last few years, whilst Prime Minister Modi has been Prime Minister of India. There is another specific factor, which is that Russian oil comes at a relatively low price. Any alternative to Russian oil would come at a higher price. The cost of energy in a country like India is critical to maintaining a cap on prices, general prices. The reason why Prime Minister Modi and his party are felt to have underperformed in the recent parliamentary election in India is because of rising prices, the inflation surge which has affected India in the same way as it has affected pretty much every other country. I would have thought that the Indian government would be extremely reluctant to start buying more expensive oil from other producers when it can buy cheaper oil from Russia. My guess is that not only will the Indians continue to buy their oil from Russia, but that they will negotiate with the Russians to get further discounts on the oil they are receiving from Russia to make up, at least in part, for the loss of export markets to the United States. Anyway, that's India. Much more important is China. Now, China also, and this has not been widely commented upon or reported, is currently involved in Stockholm in intense discussions with the Americans, led by the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, in order to consolidate the trade agreements that were reached in Geneva and London over the last few months, which resulted in a mutual reduction in tariffs between between China and the United States had risen to above 100% on the cost of goods. China was no longer buying American civil aviation products, engines and that kind of thing, and was also restricting exports to the United States of rare earths. And the United States buckled in the face of all of this. There were reports that American stores, Walmart and the others, were warning the Trump administration that stockpiles of finished goods imported from China were running out, and that before long there would be empty shelves in American shops. And there were also reports, heavily covered by the Financial Times, that because of Chinese restrictions on the exports of rare earths, production lines across the West were starting to close down, and that the US car industry was especially badly affected, but so was the aviation industry, and so, by the way, was the US military-industrial complex. It was becoming increasingly difficult, for example, to maintain production of F-35 fighter jets. Anyway, the result was a series of meetings, the first one in Geneva, then there was a follow-up meeting in London, and the result was a pause in the economic war between China and the United States. But it's clear now that there were no final agreements made between China and the United States at that time. And the discussions that are taking place currently in Stockholm, as I said, where the American delegation is led by the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, are intended to agree a final resolution to this dispute so as to allow trade between China and the United States to continue on a more stable long-term basis. Now, the point is that if there is no agreement in Stockholm, according to Trump's own timetables, we are going to go back to the 100% plus tariffs. In other words, the economic war between China and the United States. And the deadline for that is the 12th of August. Now, if you do simple arithmetic, you can see that deadline, 12th of August, aligns almost exactly with a 10 to 12 day deadline that Donald Trump was giving the Russians, or was purporting to give to the Russians yesterday. And I'm going to suggest that perhaps another factor that Trump might have had in mind is that he needs to put pressure on the Chinese. He wants to put pressure on the Chinese in the negotiations that are taking place in Stockholm. And he's not the only American official to do so. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has been making tough comments recently that it is only because of China that Russia is able to continue its military campaign in Ukraine. A claim, by the way, which is entirely untrue, but never mind. But that is what Marco Rubio has said. And, of course, there's been a whole succession of other measures being taken in the US Congress, which are also obviously intended to pile on the pressure on China, and perhaps even to ensure that the negotiations in Stockholm don't succeed. And the Chinese have picked up on this. So today there is an article in Global Times by Fan Ansi, Global Times, to repeat again, Chinese newspaper owned by the People's Daily, which is the official organ of the Chinese Communist Party. So Global Times is a very authoritative source of opinion on the part of China with respect to policy between Chinese policy. Anyway, Global Times has published this article, and its title is Senators Attempt to Introduce Anti-China Bills Amid Third Round Trade Talks. Move reflects growing anxiety, extremism of some China hawks in Washington. And then the article continues, amid the ongoing trade talks between China and the United States, a number of US senators from both major parties are attempting to introduce bills this week targeting China, reportedly over old cliches such as minority groups, dissidents, and Taiwan, emphasizing security and human rights, according to media reports on Tuesday. The moves reflect growing anxiety and extremism of some China hawks in Washington, Chinese experts are saying. Influenced by Taiwan-related lobbying groups and hardline forces, Congress has become a stubborn roadblock seeking to undermine any constructive efforts of the US administration amid the third round of China-US trade talks. The three bills have Democratic and Republican sponsors. The move comes as President Trump's push to reach economic agreements between the world's two biggest economies have gained strong support in the US Congress, especially from his fellow Republicans. However, it has also prompted some China hawks to worry that the US government is de-emphasizing security issues. It does appear that President Trump is keen to negotiate some kind of deal with China, and gaps are opening between his approach to China and the approaches of some members of his team, as well as with Congress, which overall has been quite hawkish on China. And this is based on, this is a comment reported by Global Times, but made by Bonnie Glaser, an Asia expert at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And the comment then continues, the article then continues and references the fact that Anna Kelly, Deputy Press Secretary at the White House, said on Monday that President Trump has publicly discussed his desire for a constructive relationship with China. He's focusing on advancing American interests, such as leveling the playing fields for American industries. And Global Times then continues. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has repeatedly called on the United States to stop handling China-US relations with the outdated mindset of zero-sum games, stop letting its China policy be guided by so-called political correctness, seriously uphold the principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation, and bring China US relations back onto the track of sound and steady development. Anyway, there's an awful lot more in the article, but I'm not going to discuss it further in this program. Suffice to say that these negotiations in Stockholm are obviously proving very difficult. Some people in Washington are unhappy about them because they do not want an improvement in US-China relations. There is posturing going on in Congress with all kinds of bills, 3 bills being proposed. There is posturing within the administration with Marco Rubio, who has a long history as a very strong anti-China hawk, making comments about China being the party that enables Russia to continue the special military operation. And I don't think Donald Trump's comment yesterday about Russia, which ultimately is threatening China with secondary tariffs, is out of line with all of these various comments that we are seeing. Now, I have said many times that the first rule of diplomacy is never to bluff China, because the bluff is always going to be called. The Chinese feel that they called Donald Trump's bluff back in April when he had to scale back his retaliatory tariffs because of the crisis that was developing in the US industrial sector and with the cut-off of rare earths and the crisis that was beginning to develop in American stores. I think the Chinese believe that if Donald Trump were to make good on his threats, China would call his bluff again. I think that there continues to be a widespread narrative in the West connected to some extent with deflation within the Chinese economy, that China is somehow in a weak position relative to the United States. I don't believe that that is the case at all. I don't think that the Chinese believe that that is the case. I think they provided abundant statistics about China's foreign trade patterns, which confirm the contrary. But anyway, one way or the other, I don't think the Russians or the Chinese are in any mood to submit to Donald Trump's dictation. And for what it's worth, I doubt that India will either. There is always, bear in mind, the possibility that things can be rerouted in all sorts of elegant ways, that Turkey, for example, might buy Russian oil on behalf of India and then ship it to India, claiming that it's Saudi oil or Venezuelan oil or something of that kind. Turkey has taken an outspoken pro-Ukrainian position in the war, and on the strength of that, it could argue that it should not be subjected to secondary tariffs. But of course, if that happens, then an immediate leak is opened up in the whole system. The EU recently imposed a further reduced cap on Russian oil, which will be ferried by tankers that are insured in London. I understand that Greek ship owners have already made it clear that they are extremely unhappy about that and that they're not going to comply and that they are going to continue to operate through the shadow fleet. I know more about this than I'm saying. I don't want to say more. But anyway, so one way or the other, this is not going to have the effect that perhaps Lindsey Graham and others imagine. And as I said, I think that all of the big 3 countries involved, China, India, Russia, are not going to capitulate. They're all going to call the bluff. And as I said, one way or the other, I expect China and India to continue to buy Russian oil. So that is, I think, my first comments to make about these threats that Donald Trump made yesterday. Now, of course, it could be possible that he will act on these threats in the way that he said, that he will impose those 100% tariffs on China, that he will impose 100% tariffs on India, or it could be that India will stop buying Russian oil, catapulting its own economy into deeper crisis. It could be that Russian oil exports are indeed going to be restricted. Again, as I have said in previous programs, it is facile to believe that this is going to change Russian policy with respect to Ukraine. It's certainly going to create issues internally within Russia, within its economy. But the country remains self-sufficient in energy. It remains self-sufficient in food. It will still be able to sell some oil on the international markets because there will always be a demand for oil, and restrictions on legal sales of Russian oil will inevitably lead to an increase in the oil price, to partially offsetting the effect of any restrictions. But Russia, as I've discussed in many places, has a significant industrial base. It produces most of the goods that it needs. It actually is, as a continental economy, less dependent on trade than some, even though it has traded quite a lot, given that it is in a war on what it considers an existential threat to itself. It always has the abilities and the tools to move towards a more mobilized version of its economy, and though that will cause some stresses in Russia, it will not be enough, I predict, to cause the Russians to change their policies in the special military operation. Donald Trump and his advisors perhaps don't realize this, but perhaps they should take into account what happened to his predecessor, Joe Biden. Joe Biden and his officials, when they unrolled sanctions against Russia in February 2022, well, I can remember them saying at the time, I remember a briefing by an anonymous White House official talking about how Russia had a one-dimensional economy, how the sanctions that would be imposed on Russia would go right up to the very top level and would stay there, how they would collapse the currency and create hyperinflation in Russia. And of course, none of that happened. And there was instead a significant increase in energy prices across the West. And that led to higher inflation at a time when inflation was already rising because of the overspending that the Biden administration was engaged in. And I'm going to suggest that it was that inflation with the cost of living crisis that came in its wake, which ultimately doomed both Biden's and Kamala Harris's bids for election in 2024. Now, the other thing it did, of course, was that it exposed the extent to which the sanctions emperor in the United States has no clothes. It reduced Biden's leverage over the Russians. In fact, it exposed the fact that he didn't actually have that much leverage over the Russians. And it severely dented the political authority of the United States and of the Biden administration globally, as it became increasingly clear that American sanctions threats were not as devastating as they initially appeared. They also had the effect of accelerating the development of the BRICS and of the various payment systems that the BRICS are now working upon. The reputational damage to the United States and the economic damage to the United States and the political damage which followed for the Biden administration continues to shape the current political situation, the international situation. And of course was, as I've said, one of the key reasons why Donald Trump was elected president last year. Now, if Donald Trump chooses to go down the same road, he runs the same sort of risks that Biden did. He imposes tariffs or he imposes sanctions, further sanctions on Russia, secondary tariffs on China and India. But if those don't work, if the special military operation continues as before, if Ukraine continues to go down, if the Russian economy doesn't collapse, if international trade continues circumventing the sanctions and secondary tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed, then that will again have three consequences. First, inevitably, it is going to increase inflation in the United States, intensifying the cost of living crisis that exists there. It is also going to further weaken the impression around the world that American tariffs and American sanctions and all of these mechanisms of economic coercion and pressure that the United States has been engaged in are not as powerful as had previously been believed, whilst at the same time probably accelerating the development of the BRICS and its alternative trading and payment systems. And third, inevitably, it is going to damage Donald Trump's own political standing in the United States in exactly the same way that it damaged Joe Biden's. Now, coming back to Dmitry Medvedev, that is essentially the point he made. He published comments on X in which he said that Donald Trump's actions set the United States on a course towards war, not between the United States and Russia, but between Donald Trump and his own country. Now that provoked anger and a fierce refutation from Senator Lindsey Graham, to which Dmitry Medvedev responded, I'm not going to go and analyze or discuss that, frankly, rather inane exchange. The point that Medvedev was making is, look at what happened to Joe Biden. That is exactly, in fact, the point that Medvedev said in his various comments, and it's the lesson that he needs to heed. And again, it's surprising perhaps that the president doesn't get this. Now, coming back to Donald Trump, there are a number of things about his comments yesterday. Firstly, he made it, I think, fairly clear that he doesn't really want to impose sanctions on Russia at all. He is extremely unhappy at the fact that he is in this situation. He spoke again about his great disappointment with Vladimir Putin and about how he'd had all these nice conversations with Putin, but that these conversations didn't seem to lead anywhere. Now, here I have to say, I'm going to push back on what Donald Trump is saying. I obviously am not a party to the conversations between Putin and Trump, but Putin set out his conditions on how the war in Ukraine might end in the speech he gave to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. As far as I can see, in every single discussion Putin has had with Trump, he has reminded Trump of those conditions. He's done that also in his discussions with Steve Witkoff, and he did it also in his telephone conversation with Emmanuel Macron. The problem is not that Putin has been stringing Donald Trump along. It is that Donald Trump doesn't want to listen to what Vladimir Putin is telling him. At no point has Trump or any Western official wanted to engage with Putin on the terms he set out back on the 14th of June last year. They act as if these comments of Putin, this very important statement of Putin, to which the Russians return again and again, isn't meant seriously and didn't really happen. Now, a short time ago, Glenn Deason and myself did another program with Professor John Mearsheimer, and he made that very point, that there is this unwillingness in the West to take seriously Putin's demands, even though Putin is leading the country which is fighting the war in Ukraine and which is winning the war in Ukraine, and which the Western powers say they want to end. It's very bizarre if you want to persuade the apparent winner of that war to stop conducting that war if you are not prepared to negotiate on that party's terms. It doesn't mean that you have to agree to them. It doesn't mean that you have to agree to every point that the Russians are making. What you need to do, however, is to address those points seriously, to enter into discussions with the Russians on those terms, to see whether the Russians might, over time, show flexibility. This would be a protracted process. It would require strong negotiating teams by both sides. It's a process that might last months, perhaps even a year, though maybe we no longer have that year. But anyway, that is what could have been done. It reminds me very much of the approach the Western powers took in the autumn and winter of 2021-2022, when the Russians proposed 2 draft treaties addressing the issue of NATO expansion and asking the Western powers to basically agree to cease all further eastward expansion of NATO. There were negotiations between the Americans and the Russians about those treaties. The Americans did speak politely to the Russians over those treaties. There were a few minor tweaks in the American position, which for a time did seem to promise some possible movement. But the reality was, as became increasingly clear, that in fact the Americans and NATO simply weren't interested in talking about the treaties at all. They didn't take them seriously. They spoke to the Russians, as they saw it, more by way of indulging the Russians rather than taking the Russian concerns seriously, which of course was what brought us directly to the special military operation. And it seems to me that just as Trump is at risk of making the same mistake with sanctions and sanctions threats that he's making now, as Biden did, he has made essentially the same mistake in his diplomatic approach to the Russians. He doesn't want to listen to what they are saying. And he says how disappointed he is with them. He seems bewildered that the Russians don't want to agree to better economic and financial relations with him. Well, the Russians might say that they too are disappointed with Trump, that the fact that he simply won't listen or address their concerns. And I would say that if the Russians did say that, and I'm sure that they're saying it to each other in private, they're saying it with a great deal more justice. I don't know what advice Donald Trump has been given. I'm afraid he has lent far too heavily on Keith Kellogg, and people around him. I think that at some point he's going to have to understand that the advice those people gave him was wrong, and that negotiations with parties like the Russians and the Chinese, and I'm going to guess the Indians as well, are not quite as straightforward as the negotiations with the European Union, which I will turn to shortly. How as easy as those negotiations have been. Now, that then brings me to the next point, which is that, of course, Donald Trump is imposing tariffs on all kinds of countries. The Financial Times has now calculated that the effective tariff that the United States has now imposed on trade with the United States by the rest of the world stands at around 17.5%. This is a high tariff by any measure. It takes us back to the situation which existed in the 1930s. It's, I believe, even higher than the tariffs that the United States was imposing at that time. There is a certain view that up to now these tariffs have not had the depressing effect on the US economy that many people expected that they would. There is the further view that they are bringing in significant receipts, though I have to say these receipts don't come even remotely close to closing the yawning gap in the American budget deficit, which on the contrary appears to be widening. But anyway, a lot of people are perhaps rather complacently saying that these tariffs are making no significant difference. I am far from convinced about this. I've been looking at some of the economic numbers in the United States, and whilst it's difficult for me to unravel what part in this story is being played by the tariffs and what is being played by other factors, I am not sure that I agree with the widespread view that the United States currently enjoys robust economic health. First of all, inflation does seem to be on an uptick again. This is something that the president has been very resistant to. He's been trying to get the Federal Reserve Board to cut interest rates. He's clearly frustrated by the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Jerome Powell. The two men clearly don't get on. The president visited the Federal Reserve Board recently in what struck me as, frankly, a somewhat menacing move. The fact that the president wants interest rates cut suggests to me that he's perhaps less confident about the underlying health of the economy than he pretends. Anyway, put that all aside. I cannot but help noticing that in the last 32 months, which covers both the Biden administration and the first couple of months of the Trump administration, industrial production in the United States has continued to contract. There are growing problems in the oil and gas industries. The shale revolution, as I've discussed in previous programs, appears to have run its course, and we are likely before long to start seeing an overall decline in production of oil and gas in the United States, which, given the direction of the president's policies, could cause further stress. There are also signs that in the real economy, things are less healthy than they seem. Apparently, housing startouts are continuing to have registered further declines. There was a very strange article, but perhaps an indicative one, that spending in resort towns like Las Vegas is significantly down, sharply down, and that Americans in surveys are continuing to speak of themselves being under severe financial stress, which is, of course, consistent with a slowdown, that kind of slowdown in spending. Americans do spend, and they are taking out credit, but increasingly it seems that they're taking this out on loans, some of which, rather alarmingly, are being used to pay things like groceries. Now, moving forward, why are, in that case, the GDP numbers in the United States coming out as strong as they seem? I am going to suggest that there are two reasons for this, just as the very heavy spending of the Biden administration goosed up the GDP figures, so the similarly high spending of the Trump administration continues to goose up the GDP figures. And of course, we have the exuberance on Wall Street, which is narrowly focused on a small group of tech producers and does seem to be perhaps over-dependent on expectations of the development of AI technology in the short term. I have to say that some of this does remind me a little of the state of the US economy in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. A tech boom on Wall Street, increasingly heavy spending, starting to create stresses in the economy. Eventually, of course, all of that led to the financial crash of 2008. I'm not saying we're there or close to being there. I don't know. I don't have that level of granular understanding of the realities of the US economy. I'm not sure anybody does, actually, just to say. It may be that my feelings about this are wrong altogether. But what I will say is, I think it is very dangerous in this time when there are tariffs already, when this tariff experiment is still at its early days, to experiment with further sanctions and further tariffs that might provoke a further energy shock and inflation spike, putting aside the political risks for Donald Trump personally and the geopolitical damage this might cause to the United States. It seems to me that it does create risks for the US economy and for US consumers, which presumably the whole purpose of the MAGA movement was to reduce, not to increase. Anyway, this is all I'm going to say about this whole discussion arising from Donald Trump's comments tomorrow. They may mean a lot, they may mean nothing, they may mean a little. It could be, for example, and this would not be out of character, that at the end of those 12 days, Donald Trump imposes an entirely meaningless 100% tariff on Russia, but holds back from imposing secondary tariffs on buyers of Russian oil. It could be. Or he might impose secondary tariffs on buyers of Russian oil. And then he might do the same thing that he did with Iranian oil exports, which is grant exemptions to some of the major buyers of Russian oil, as he did with Iran and as he did with China, which is, of course, the biggest buyer of Iranian oil. I don't know what Donald Trump is going to do. But to repeat again, the Russians show no sign of bending in the face of these threats. The Chinese show no sign of bending in the face of these and multiple other threats. The Indians are showing increasing signs of irritation and anger, and they're not only deepening their relations with the BRICS, by the way, but they seem to be making serious efforts to improve their relations with China at this time. Whatever it is that Trump does over the next few weeks, I think he's already done some damage with these comments and the comments that were made a short while ago. The only question is whether he will take the plunge and make the damage exponentially greater. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this issue. As I said, I made many points. I can imagine that many people will want to respond to them in the threads. I'll be interested to read what they have to say. Anyway, let's now return to the topic of the conflict in Ukraine. Another big missile strike by the Russians last night. One of the missiles allegedly struck a prison. I'm not certain that it was a Russian missile. It might have been a Ukrainian air defense missile. There's been those claims before. Or it might have been a Russian missile that went astray. I'm not sure why the Russians would want to attack a prison, unless perhaps it was being used for something else. No doubt the Russian Ministry of Defense will respond to it. But the point is that over the course of last night, Ukraine was again hammered. And there is no sign at the moment that this is going to change. And, well, we've had lots of reports about floods of Western weapons being sent to Ukraine. And it doesn't look as if at the moment they are. Now, a couple of days ago, in one of my programs, I mentioned that the United States appeared to be providing some technical help for Hawk missile systems that the United States had supplied to Ukraine, and perhaps some additional Hawk missiles as well. And I also said that the United States looked as if it was supplying more Bradley infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine. Now, on the second, it may be that that was wrong. The reports that I've seen, the more recent reports that I have seen, suggest that what the United States is actually providing to Ukraine is not additional Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, but technical and maintenance support for Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, those 120 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, which have already been supplied and which, of course, must be being used to a very, very heavy degree. Now, it could be that there is going to be an additional supply of Bradleys under cover of this funding of maintenance. I don't know, and I am not sure. But so far, as far as I can tell, the United States has sold no weapons to NATO. NATO hasn't bought any weapons. NATO hasn't set up any mechanism yet to buy weapons from the United States. The United States doesn't seem to be directly supplying weapons to Ukraine, apart from whatever's left from Biden's various packages, and apart from that one drawdown of around $300 million that Donald Trump authorized, which we are told will be the last one. So it doesn't seem as if Ukraine is getting much in the way of more weapons. It certainly doesn't seem that Ukraine is getting any more Patriot air defense missile interceptors. There's been talk about other systems, SAMP, air-speed systems from France and Italy, but as I understand it, these have all been basically burned through, and there would have to be renewed production before they could be provided. There's the IRIS-T systems and the NASAM systems that are being produced by Germany and Norway. IRIS-Ts take a long time to produce, NASAMs as well. I don't know what systems the West is able to supply at the moment. And they're not going to be able to supply more systems anytime soon that can match the deluge of drones and missiles that the Russians are now continuously launching against Ukraine. And a Russian official recently said that the Russians have up to now held back the more advanced Duran drones, the ones that are going to be equipped with a jet engine, and that these will soon be deployed against Ukraine in multiple quantities. There is talk that these drones are being produced in large numbers, these jet-powered versions of the Duran. But the comment from this Russian official rather suggests that they are being stockpiled, which makes one wonder what is going to come in the autumn and winter, when presumably they're going to start to be used in quantities, in large numbers. Well, we will see. But with every night that passes, with every day that passes, the balance of the battle in the sky continues to tilt further and further to the Russian side. There is apparently a major expansion of the big drone factory in Kazan. There are, as I said already, reports that there are factories being developed to produce more drones in Korea, North Korea, and in the Far East. I suspect we're nowhere close to seeing production of drones reduce. Now, peak, not reduce. Now, there was an article that appeared in the Financial Times based on a study by the Kiev Institute, which claimed that the Russians may have run through their Soviet stockpiles of armoured vehicles, that there seems to be less drawdown of armoured vehicles, old armoured vehicles, and refurbishment of these armoured vehicles. In Russia, and as I said, there was speculation, as I said, that these big stockpiles have been run down. Possibly this is true, but the reality is that production of tanks and armoured vehicles appears to be on a steadily rising curve in Russia. And the Ukrainians themselves are saying that production is outpacing loss. So given that that is so, and given that Russian armoured vehicle losses have sharply declined over the last couple of months, I'm going to make a guess, even if these figures are true, and I wonder how the Kiev Institute could obtain this information. Anyway, even if these figures are true, I suspect that there are other reasons that go beyond depletions of Soviet stockpiles. It's more likely, quite simply, that the Russians need to draw on those stockpiles less and less. And in terms of drones and artillery shells and those kind of things, well, there, as I said, production, which is coming both from Russia and North Korea, seems to me, at least my belief is it is coming from North Korea, seems to be fully up to what the Russians need. And it is the Ukrainians currently that are suffering a critical shortage in artillery shells, as they've admitted, which they don't seem to be able, and which the West doesn't seem able any longer to address. So the balance continues to tilt further and further on the battlefields on the Russian side. Now, what has happened on the battlefields? Well, over the last couple of hours, there's been quite a lot of information from Pokrovsk, from the area of Pokrovsk, and that does seem overall to suggest, well, if I have to say it, an increasingly darkening picture. Now, yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry announced that a village northeast, another village northeast of Pokrovsk had been captured, and this village, whose name is apparently is it's just next to Novotoretskoye. It appears to be a very, very small place. Boykivka. Anyway, Boykivka. I'm sorry, I cannot read these easily. Apparently this village has been captured, and that suggests that the Russians continue to advance in this area northeast of Pokrovsk. The Russians are also saying that the Ukrainians have pulled back to a third line of defenses on higher ground, based around two villages, Nikanorivka and Suvorovo. I've been able to find Nikanorivka on the maps. I cannot find Suvorovo. The point about these villages is that they are located well to the north of Pokrovsk, and if they do fall, and the fall of this village of Boykivka, all of that is bringing the Russians closer and closer to cutting the road that runs through Rodinska northwards, from the north down to Pokrovsk. The Russians would be in a position to cut this road north of Rodinska. Now, perhaps this explains certain claims that were appearing in parts of in some of the Russian telegram channels yesterday, which is that there is already movement of Ukrainian forces, of Ukrainian troops, basically escaping from Mirnograd specifically, but also to some extent from Pokrovsk, northward along this road through Rodinske and Bilitske. Bilitske is another village on this road lying somewhat to the north of Rodinske. And it could be that with the Russians apparently close to Rodinske, shelling Rodinske relentlessly, and with Bilitske, which is close to this village of Nikanorivka that I spoke about, which is apparently the next Russian objective. Bilitske is very close to Nikanorivka. It could be that the garrison, the Ukrainian garrison in Mirnograd, is now increasingly worried that it could itself be cut off. Now, the question is, firstly, is this report true? I would say that given that the Russians heavily shell this road, the one that passes through Rodinske and Bilitske, and that their drones are very active along this road. Any Ukrainian troops that are basically fleeing Mirnograd northward up this road are already going to be facing very, very heavy losses. But is this true? Is this actually even happening at all? Well, of course, the answer is I don't know. This is the problem, because we don't have that kind of detailed information at the moment from the front lines, from the setting up what's actually going on in Mirnograd. But it would not surprise me, because the Russians, TASS, the official Russian news agency TASS, Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government, were claiming yesterday that the Russians have advanced west of Novoekonomichny, that they're now in the process of storming the coal mine, the Dimitrov coal mine, located between Mirnograd and Novoekonomichny, that the Russians have also made attempts to break into Mirnograd from the south. It could be that the Ukrainian garrison is under extreme pressure in Mirnograd. There must be severe problems with supplies, given that the road through Rodinska is perhaps unusable for supplies. And there must be worries on the part of these Ukrainian troops that if they remain in Mirnograd for much longer, then once the Russians have captured Nikhanorivka and Suvorovo, wherever that is, and then close in on Bilitska, which might be a less defendable place than Rodinska. Well, I gather it's much smaller. Then the road will be cut, and the Ukrainian troops, will be cut off in what is now the living hell, which is Mirnograd. So it's not implausible, but this is what the reports are saying. Reports are also saying, and these are from, I want to stress, these are all coming from Russian channels now. The Ukrainian channels continue to be very gloomy about the situation, but they're not providing many details. But anyway, the reports are saying that Russian drones and are now also heavily attacking and the small road that passes through the village of Grishine, which is located northwest of Pokrovsk. Grishine is under secure Ukrainian control. As far as I know, there are no Russian troops close to it. But Grishine and the small road that passes through it, again according to these reports, is now the major supply artery for Pokrovsk. The E50 road, which lies to the south of Grishine, having it been in effect cut. Now, I noticed last night that the Google map that I have of Pokrovsk says that the E50 road, which enters Pokrovsk, is temporarily closed. Now, that could be that it's closed to civilian traffic, which of course would not surprise me. But curiously, it doesn't say that about any of the other roads, the other big supply roads that lead into Pokrovsk. It doesn't say, for example, about the same E50 road when it leads into Pokrovsk from the south. Perhaps the Russians have reached the E50 road, the junction of the E50 road, as has been discussed by Redovka, in which case the road through Grishine may be the only remaining transport route into Pokrovsk. It is impossible for me to say. Now, there is another report as well, which again comes from a Russian source, which says that the Ukrainian defenses in Pokrovsk are indeed extremely disorganized, and that the Ukrainians are basically concentrated in two locations. One is in the center of Pokrovsk, deep inside the town, and the other is in the micro district of Shakhtarsky, which is somewhat to the south, abutting the Jubilee Park. Now, again, there is no independent confirmation of this, but according to this report, not only are the Ukrainian troops concentrated in these two places, but logistics, supplies have essentially broken down. Communication between these two Ukrainian groupings is very difficult, and they're not able to coordinate effectively with each other. And the Russian Air Force and the Russian artillery and forces now have a very firm grip on the territory southwest of Pokrovsk. Now, early this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that another village close to Pokrovsk has been captured, and this is a village called Novoukrainka. Now, this is located immediately to the south of Pokrovsk, and it further confirms overall Russian dominance of the area to the south of Pokrovsk. Novoukrainka is located to the south of the high-rise building area, which is the main citadel, apparently, that the Ukrainians have in Pokrovsk. I'm not sure how that relates to the micro-district of Shakhtarska. Perhaps we're talking about the same place. I don't know. Anyway, there is clearly then a confusing picture, but the overall impression is of a tightening ring around the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk, and of a situation there that is going more and more critical basically by the hour. The Russians are also saying, or claiming, maybe I should say, saying that the Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk, who are relatively few in number, are having to move around the town in soft-skinned vehicles, in passenger cars, civilian SUVs, and such things, that armor has essentially been withdrawn from Pokrovsk, that they therefore are dangerously exposed when they try to move around Pokrovsk to attacks by Russian drones and to shelling by the Russians, and that this inevitably means that when passenger vehicles carrying Ukrainian troops are attacked and destroyed, which happens quite often, the level of casualties is extremely high. A grisly detail, which again I can't confirm, but which is entirely plausible. Now, if this is all correct, then of course it again substantiates the claims that Ukraine is very short of armored vehicles, which is what General Syrskyi, the overall Ukrainian military commander, also said about a week ago. Well, I've spent a lot of time discussing the situation in Pokrovsk today. There are lots of things going on elsewhere in the battlefields. As I said, there continues to be further Russian pressure in the area of Konstantinovka, and also apparently in western Donbass, and indeed even in Zaporozhye region as well. In fact, today the Russian Defense Ministry also said that another village in Zaporozhye region had been captured somewhere. I'm not sure where that is. But Pokrovsk for me is clearly the main battle, and my sense is that we are perhaps coming towards the end. This is all very contingent on these reports on the Russians being true, but I have no reason to doubt them, even if they're mistaken in many of, or some, or even many of their details. The Russian Defense Ministry, as I said, is providing us information about further Russian gains around Pokrovsk, and for the Ukrainians, all of this points to a darkening picture. Now, the crisis in Pokrovsk, one would assume, is Zelensky's major concern at this present time. But in fact, I doubt that this is the case. The probable issue that will have alarmed Zelensky most is that yesterday the European Union paused transfer of 17.2 billion euros in emergency loans to Ukraine, these being funded apparently from frozen Russian assets. Now, I ought to say this is a controversial thing. My colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has repeatedly and correctly pointed out that it's difficult to believe that the interest these frozen assets is generating is anywhere close to reaching the levels that would be needed to service these loans that are being paid out to Ukraine, or at least to fund these loans. And in fact, we've had a kind of admission of this from Euroclear, the clearing agency where the Russian central bank's frozen assets are located. They are alarmed, Euroclear is very alarmed, at an EU plan to transfer some of these assets to more risky institutions in order to invest them rather in more risky assets in order to generate more revenue out of them. And the Euroclear chief executive, Valérie Urban, who is clearly very unhappy with this whole approach that the EU has been taking to these Russian assets, has said that if this is done, it would amount to expropriation. If you increase the revenues, you increase the risks, and who is bearing that risk? And she says that taking steps like that, if it were to result in losses, would put Euroclear and perhaps the European countries that are taking on these risks in a dangerous position. The systemic risk would certainly increase dramatically if we would have to go beyond the risk profile that we have and which is authorized by our supervisors. Urban has warned that such a scheme would create a lot of risks for Euroclear and for European markets globally. Legally speaking, the creation of an SPV would mean an expropriation of the cash from Euroclear. And she added that this would result clearly in a position that we cannot bear. And she's also added that Euroclear already faces more than 100 lawsuits over immobilized Russian assets, including those belonging to oligarchs and other sanctioned entities, and that the position is deteriorating. Euroclear's position is deteriorating, and she goes on to say we should also certainly expect more Russian retaliation in all sorts of forms. And basically she's saying that if the European Union really does want to start taking these kind of risks, then it needs to start providing Euroclear with guarantees, legal guarantees, in case things go wrong. Something which, so far, the European Union, or to be more precise, its member states, show no enthusiasm to do. But put that all aside, the reason that the European Union is giving for suspending the transfer of this 17.2 billion euros to Ukraine in loans is the attack by Zelensky on Nabu and Sopa. And they're saying that if Ukraine doesn't sort this out completely, if they don't satisfy the Europeans that anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine, as they like to call them, will continue as before, if, in other words, Nabu and Sopa aren't given their full independence back, then the European Union might suspend all financial aid to Ukraine entirely. Now, I don't believe the European Union will do that. I think they know perfectly well that if they did that, that would result in a rapid economic collapse in Ukraine. Zelensky has already said that the budget deficit is around 65 billion euros. Ukraine cannot raise that money itself. It is already in default on its loans, so there's no way it could raise that money. There's no mechanism for raising further taxes. There's no money in Ukraine that could cover a deficit of that size. Very rapidly, if financial aid to Ukraine were to stop, the currency would collapse and Ukraine would descend into a hyperinflationary spiral from which it would not be able to escape. The collapse in Ukraine, in other words, would accelerate. And I cannot imagine that that is what the European Union is going to want to do. So again, I think this is a bluff. But we could see that the pressure on Zelensky is very strong. The European Union is clearly very alarmed at the loss of independence of Nabu and Sopa. They are obviously as cynical by Zelensky's promises that his new law, whatever it is going to return their independence. They're obviously as cynical about that new law as I am. And they are worried that if Zelensky continues his attack on Nabu and Sopa, they will lose whatever remaining vestige of control over Zelensky that they still have. And I said in my program yesterday that if Zelensky has indeed, to some extent, retreated in terms of the attack on Nabu and Sopa, it's not because middle-class people, many of them students, are protesting against him in what had been relatively small and rather scattered demonstrations that don't seem to be leading anywhere. It is because of these threats to cut off funding that are coming now from the European Union. Now, this is a game of bluff. Who will win this game remains to be seen. It's going to increase the stress on Zelensky over the next couple of days and weeks. I'm going to make a guess that he's going to give the Europeans further assurances that his new law will indeed restore independence to Nabu and Sopa. I think he will nonetheless still want to try to rein those two agencies in. I think he might try to replace their personnel, for example, with people more loyal to himself. The question is whether the European Union will accept that as an off-ramp. Anyway, we shall see. It's a game of bluff, and I'm not going to say who's going to win this game. I think both sides are bluffing to a certain degree. Zelensky cannot afford an aid cut-off. The Europeans cannot afford a financial crash in Ukraine. So we shall see what happens. But the reality is that the Russians continue their advance on the battlefronts. The Ukrainians continue to be eroded. Donald Trump's threats are not swaying the Russians. I don't see any evidence that they're intimidating or unnerving the Chinese. To repeat again, if Pokrovsk falls, which I think it will, perhaps sooner than I'd expected, say a week ago, well, the crisis in Ukraine will then begin in earnest, as will the panic in the West. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.